All right, welcome to this week's lecture. I know I said that I was going to postpone, and that's kind of because these next few topics, the next two chapters, kind of go together. And I should have incorporated last week's into this also because it talked about formal suicide. But this lecture is going to cover chapters 8 and 9, and I'm not going to cover absolutely everything in a ton of detail, but later on, I'm going to try to get some discussion started for all of us, and so we can try to apply what we're learning about these tactics that Koukl talks about, and to kind of help develop the understanding for each of them. So the suicide tactic, in last lecture I briefly described formal suicide, which is part of this. This week is practical suicide, the sibling rivalry, and then the infanticide will all be talked about here. And it's, like I said, it's covered in chapters 8 and chapters 9. So the goal is to begin to recognize self-defeating views and then to think more deeply about people's views. Alright, so statements. All statements are about something. So the statement, dogs have fleas, is about dogs. And then, there's no truth. That statement is about truth. So these suicidal or self-defeating views, which Koukl calls them suicidal, but it's just basically another way to say that the view defeats itself. And so these self-defeating views do not meet or satisfy their own criteria of truth. Basically, these views put something forward, whatever they claim or state, and then it doesn't fulfill what it claims or states. So, for example, there is no truth. So you would want to ask, is that statement true? If that statement is true, then it's false. So, or if it's false, why should we listen to that person? It's kind of odd when you think about it and say it out loud, but some of the claims, when you really think them through, don't make a lot of sense. For another example is, you shouldn't make moral judgments. This is a moral judgment, and the word shouldn't is the key to that, because when you say shouldn't or must, that's moral language. It's basically indicating the oughtness of something, basically saying you should, you will, or you have to do this, or you have to not do that. So practical suicide, now these are statements that fail in practice, or they don't work in real life. And he uses several examples in chapter 8, and I'm not going to cover all of those examples. But moral relativism is one example. So it is wrong to push your morality on others. So holding this belief is not incoherent, right? It makes sense, and there's nothing inconsistent on the surface. But once you push the idea on someone else, you are breaking your own belief, because you are pushing what you think to be moral on someone else. Now, some stuff that I'd like to cover before I move on to the next slide is the suicide tactic works because it trades on a fundamental rule of logic, and it's the law of non-contradiction. So the law of non-contradiction states that two contradictory statements cannot be true at the same time. So A cannot be non-A at the same time in the same way. So all suicidal views express or entail contradictions. So they make two different claims at odds with each other. The contradictions, A is the case and A is not the case, may be explicit, so you can see it and it's obvious, or it may be implicit, which is internal and it's not really seen on the surface, and you kind of have to follow the view to its conclusions. So implicit contradictions are often hidden. So my brother is an only child. So the contradiction here is, when you're stating my brother, you're stating, hey, I am a sibling of this person. So obviously he's not the only child because you're part of that. Sometimes the suicide can be even subtler. So, example, you shouldn't force your morality on me. And you would say, why not? Are you telling me it is wrong to say that other people are wrong? The funny thing is if they're telling you that you're wrong and they believe that it's wrong to tell people that they're wrong, then they're wrong. And it's kind of funny, again, when you kind of say that out loud. But it's good to note these little things, and to kind of, the only way to get better at it is to really start analyzing people's views, and you make note of, can you identify the basic premise? Can you identify the conviction or the claim? And then you have to ask, does the statement satisfy its own requirements? Is there an internal contradiction? And then, can the idea be stated in the form of X is the case and X is not the case at the same time? If they are, if X is the case and X is not the case at the same time, then the view is contradictory. So just keep that in mind. Now, the sibling rivalry. This points out when a single person raises two objections that are inconsistent with one another. So, for example, if someone believes in relative morality, so nothing is objectively right or wrong, but then raises the objection of evil against God. So because there's so much evil in the world, God can't exist or doesn't exist, or it's very unlikely that he exists. These two views are in conflict. So how can evil be objectively wrong if right and wrong are relative or different between each person? So you can see that the views battle each other. So the person, when you point this out, he has to give up one view or the other, or they're just going to be inconsistent and illogical, and then you can just kind of disregard their objections because they're not being logically sound or consistent in what they're trying to raise. So they're not trying to think through the reasons that they're giving for their disbelief or the objections that they're raising against you. So infanticide, this one's a little bit more difficult to grasp. So I put a quote on the slide. This is from Koukl. So, if a claim cannot be made unless the parent concept on which it depends is true, yet the claim denies the parent concept, then the argument commits infanticide. So evil is a good place to start. So God, or a transcendent being, seems to be the only objective way to base morality, right and wrong. So, but the concept of evil is based on that prior belief of there being an objective standard of right and wrong. So, for example, if an atheist cannot bring up evil as proof against God, since this objective reality would require God to be used. So, in essence, for this objection, and there's others, not just evil, atheists must steal from God to defeat God. And Frank Turek has a book called Stealing from God, and he talks about that, how there are many objections that are raised by atheists that import things from the Christian worldview and then turn it around and try to throw that back at the Christian worldview as an objection. But you can't do this because it's taking information or presuppositions from a completely different worldview system, and they're incompatible. So if you're going to raise objections as an atheist, you need to do so strictly within that framework and show how a God or transcendent being is unlikely based on your view of the world. If you try to take something from a different worldview, like an objective foundation for morality, that's universal. You could argue, an atheist could argue that, they get their morality and it's relative between cultures. There's cultural relativism, and Koukl has a book that talks about those different things, those different views. But what they can't do is say, well, morality is relative between these cultures, but then we're going to bring up something objective like evil, in the conversation and use that against you, because there's really no way for them to determine what evil is based on an atheistic, purely physical universe. It's because one culture, say they're cultural relativists, say one culture believes one thing is evil but another culture doesn't, then it's not objective. That evil is different, and it changes depending on where you are, who you're talking to. And what the goal is to say, no, there are things that are objectively good, there are things that are objectively wrong, and how do we have this? And it's because there's some standard outside of us, there's some standard that's above everything that allows us to have these objective things in place. So you have to just, like I said, be mindful and be on the watch for when people bring up these views. And if you think that there's something wrong in the view, think it through. If you have to, write it down. And if you can't think of it at that moment when you're talking to the person, like I said, you leave, you go home, you write it down, you think about it. And if you find something that's wrong with the view after you thought about it, you can always come back to that person and discuss it with them. So, conclusion, we covered suicidal tendencies in people's views. So, practical suicide, sibling rivalry, and then the infanticide. Suicidal views are those that defeat themselves in some way or another. So, either directly, indirectly, which is a little bit more subtle, or by raising multiple objections and putting them together, and they don't work together. So, this wasn't a very long lecture. And I try to keep them short so you guys aren't sitting there for hours trying to bang through the lectures. I just try to cover the topics and add a little bit if I can. But there will be some discussion via the WhatsApp, so I can try to help guide you through and hopefully solidify these ideas a little bit better. So thanks for listening, and be on the lookout for stuff and discussions coming up.